Welcome to Our Montana. I'm Mike Penfold, your program host. And boy, I'm really happy about the guest I've got today. He is the author of a book that I've just finished. It's called Tenacious Beasts. And I want to tell you, this is a really good read. One, it's fun to read. Two, it's got interesting stories in it. And three, it causes you to think about us and where we fit in the world with wild animals. And as far as that goes, where we fit in the world altogether. Christopher, Preston, welcome to Our Montana. I'm so glad to have you with me today.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
You came down from Missoula?
I did this afternoon.
And didn't get caught in the rain, or did you?
We did get caught in the rain.
Yeah.
Rained pretty good on us, but...
So you're a professor at the Montana University?
Yep.
University of Montana?
University of Montana. You got to get that right.
I got to get that right.
Yep. A professor of philosophy. We have an environmental philosophy program.
I see in your book, environmental philosopher. Tell me what that is. When I went to school years ago, they didn't have such a thing.
Sure. It is quite a new discipline.
Yeah.
Philosophers think about our place in the world. And environmental philosophers think about our place in relation to the environment, right? And the environment can take many forms. We're in an environment here. We're in a room in a city. That's an environment. But then there's a bigger environment of prairie and hills and oceans and atmosphere. And so environmental philosophers just think about our proper place on that landscape. What's the right way to interact with it? How can we make our lives richer by being in relation to that landscape in good ways? So that's what we do.
Your students pick up on that easily?
Oh, I think so. I think it's very natural to ask questions about how do I belong? How do I fit in this wonderfully complex world that we live in?
Christopher, I love your book. I really do. It's just a really good read. What was your goal in writing this book? You've done other really good books, but I tell you what I like particularly about this book is it reads nicely. It's interesting all the way. There's stories I've never heard before about wildlife. I've never heard them before. Yet it causes me and I think the reader to think about, where do we fit into this? Is that what your goal was, I hope?
Well, it totally is. One thing I was doing before writing this book is I was doing a lot on technology. And if you listen to technologists a lot, you get the feeling that the natural world is just about to disappear. It's going to get crushed underneath these waves of technological development. But it turns out that wildlife is pretty resilient. Wildlife bounces back. It kind of nudges you in the stomach and says, hey, I'm here. I want to survive. I want to do well. And as I noticed these stories of wildlife recovery, I thought, in a technological age, it's pretty good to be reminded that wildlife is still out there. And if we do the right thing, we can help it come back even more. So it was a nice little antidote, I think, to that fear that technology was going to take everything away from us.
I really like some of the stories. I thought that the one about whales was quite interesting. That's kind of a neat story, isn't it?
The story about the recovery of humpback whales is incredible. All we had to do was stop killing them. So when there was a global moratorium on hunting humpbacks, they almost immediately came back. And they're flourishing almost everywhere they live. Not quite everywhere, but almost everywhere they live. And closest to us in the North Pacific, the populations have gone up from about 1,200 to about 25,000. So that's a pretty good recovery.
That's a good recovery.
And it's said that within a decade, humpbacks will be back to where they were before whaling. And so here they are, all these humpbacks. They're not just a fascinating creature to look at and to study, but they contribute to the health of the oceans. So they're doing us a wonderful service by being back in the numbers in which they are.
Truly a tenacious beast.
They are tenacious beasts, yes.
I got kind of a kick out of the story about spotted owls, because I was kind of involved in that years ago when we were thinking about saving the forest so we could save the spotted owls. I thought that was kind of fascinating. What else has come in behind that?
Yeah, that's an interesting story, because we did what we could to save the landscape on which they lived, but that wasn't enough, because the barred owl arrived, and the barred owl basically pushes the spotted owl off its territory. So now we've got another problem, not a habitat problem, but a competition problem. And so that raises for us a question: how far are we prepared to go to make sure that the spotted owl survives. And as you know, at the moment, we're prepared to go pretty far. We're prepared to get pretty involved in suppressing the barred owl population so that the spotted owls can survive.
How did the barred owl get there? Why weren't they there? Where'd they come from?
Well, they're an East Coast species, and the best information on it suggests that they basically rode the coattails of the white settler across the Great Plains. The Great Plains was a barrier, so they were stuck on the East Coast, and the spotted owls were stuck on the West Coast. And the Great Plains didn't have enough nesting habitat for the barred owls to make it across. But when white settlers started populating the Great Plains, they killed off the beavers, which let a little more shrub and trees grow. And they also planted things like windbreaks. And so suddenly, across the Great Plains, you've got this bridge. You've got this habitat that...
Yeah, get after the spotted owls.
Yeah.
What are they doing? What are they doing with barred owls out there?
Well, the only way, it seems right now, the only way you can give the spotted owl a chance is to actually kill barred owls. And so there's people who've been running experiments for the last 5 years or so to figure out if you literally shoot barred owls out of the trees on the assumption that they're a non-native species and they're doing great harm, does that give the spotted owls enough of a chance to give them a break so that they can survive? And the evidence suggests it does. And so we've got to decide now, all right, what kind of policy do we want to have spotted owls survive on the landscape?
That's truly an ethical question, isn't it? Or is it an ethical? It strikes me as an ethical question. But.
That's definitely an ethical question. So environmental philosophy, we're trying to decide what's our proper relationship with our surroundings. So what's our proper relationship with spotted owls and barred owls? Should we be killing the barred owls so the spotted owls can survive? That's a complicated question. I don't think there's a very easy answer to that.
Not an easy answer. I don't know how I would answer that. Christopher, I sense that most recovery efforts have to do with human policies, human laws, human intervention, human activities. Is that the way you, maybe even the whales took quite an effort to quit killing whales. That was a big industry at one time.
Sure. So, at some level, if an animal's going to recover, we've got to decide to stop doing what we were doing that brought its population down. So with the case of the whale, obviously decide to stop whaling. But what I found interesting looking at these different cases is there's some animals that require an enormous amount of intervention. So we were just talking about the spotted owl, but think about the California condor. They had to all be brought inside. Yeah. The remaining 23 or so California condors brought inside, carefully captive bred.
Boy, that was a gutsy decision, wasn't it?
Yeah, wow. Literally taking them off the landscape, but bringing them inside and then nurturing them back and then slowly, carefully releasing them, keeping eyes on them. With condors, sometimes you have to bring them back in to get the lead out of their blood because that lead is poisoning them. They're picking it up from carcasses with lead shot in them. Boy. So you've got a species that requires an enormous amount of effort. Whereas compare that to the whale, all you had to do with the whale is stop killing it. This is good conservation policy, right? Stop killing something. And then the whales came back by themselves. And there's other species like that. So there's really a whole range of ways in which a species can recover. Here
in Montana, there's been a lot of work going on for bison or buffalo. Matter of fact, one of our colleagues is working on that, working with the Indian tribes to help them understand how to make that be successful. Is that a good recovery effort?
So bison, I would say, fit kind of in between the whale and the spotted owl. Bison can recover exceptionally well. A population with good habitat can grow at 17% a year, which is remarkable, really. So these are a tenacious beast that, if you give them the right conditions, they can recover really spectacularly. But at the same time, bison need some sort of management. They're pretty burly critters, right? And they knock down fences and they get themselves into trouble. And so bison recovery has required quite a lot of management. The tribes have played a fantastic role in this recovery, and it is a spectacular success because bison were down to a few hundred and they're now up to about 500,000.
The American Prairie Reserve doing experiment, I'd say, but they're learning some of our little streams come back more rapidly with bison grazing as opposed to cattle. I love cattle, so I don't want to be against cattle, but they seem like they can be successful with less fences.
Yeah, so bison are so interesting. I mean, an ecosystem engineer, we all know that they're ecosystem engineers. They help with the soil, they help with the hydrology. And what we're starting to learn is they help with creeks as well, because they don't spend as much time in the creek. They're adapted to the heat. And so they don't have to kind of wallow in a creek to cool down. And so if you spend less time in the creek, you're obviously not trampling the banks as much. You're obviously not pulling the vegetation so close to the creek. And this turns out to be a very good thing. And it gives the creeks a chance to come back.
Yeah, and modern grazing management for cattle are learning, like the livestock people are learning. You got to take care of that creek.
That's right, sure. I mean, you can manage cattle in that way too, but bison do it on their own. They know how to do that.
More naturally. Have you been out on the American Prairie Reserve?
I plan to go out there this summer. It's a long way from Missoula.
I think it's kind of an interesting experiment. So the bison also maybe is a little bit of a clash of cultures too. I mean, seems like we're sluggish getting bison out of the park. I guess it's important to do the testing that they do and getting them on the reservations, but it's quite a struggle.
There's a complicated politics there, and with many of these wildlife recoveries that I talk about, or with some of them, I think it's probably incorrect to say many, but with some of them, there's a politics there that needs to be looked at closely, and it needs to be done in a way that is fair to everybody. I mean, you can't sort of love wildlife and want them back and ignore the costs that is going to have for some people. But what I would say in addition to that is that there are occasions where wildlife cause controversy, but there are many, many more occasions where wildlife bring people together. People love having a landscape full of healthy wildlife populations, and so
it was kind of curious in Yellowstone Park with the wolves in there last winter. It was amazing to see the amount of economic benefit with a few wolves in the park have been, but it's still kind of controversial out here. But I think we're making progress, don't you, in terms of wolves here in the state?
I think we're slowly making progress. I mean, as you said, the economic argument is so strong. And potentially with what American Prairie are doing with bison, that economic argument is at play there as well. So I think this is all evolving. It's going to take time.
We got climate change. Just this past week, a friend of ours, Ricky Held, was in a lawsuit. Held versus Montana. It was a very interesting lawsuit. And it was particularly interesting, the professionals who could describe what's happening with climate. Proper wildlife management, wild beasts, tenacious beasts, do they help with climate change, or is that a problem?
No, they do. And this was one of the fascinating things I learned in writing this book. I came to think of some animals as creating, if you like, kind of a protective web around us. And let me give you an example of that. I looked at the recovery of sea otters. And sea otters off the Pacific coast do a fantastic climate thing for us. So what is that? They eat sea urchins, and when they devour enough sea urchins, the kelp forests can come back. Sea urchins are really pretty hard on kelp forests. So you get the sea otters back, and you get the kelp forests back. And the kelp forests are great habitat, great nurseries for fish, but they're also great at sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. So it turns out sea otter is kind of a friend. If you're concerned about climate change, it's a friend because it can help with that carbon struggle. And you can actually say the same thing about bison, who can help restore soils, and in those soils that carbon gets sequestered. So I ended up with this book finding quite a lot of friends and allies out there, thinking, well, I'm glad they're back because they're helping out with this problem.
Yeah. Well, it's such a huge thing on our agenda now. How do we live with the climate that's changing? Just after that trial, I got back on the web to see how much of that trial were they covering, and suddenly I've got a guy who's written a book about the fraud of climate change, and a lot of your book, I hope, will convince people of some ethical things of how we can live with wildlife that helps us. And don't you think most people love seeing wildlife? I mean,
oh, completely. Yeah. I mean, how exciting is it? That's really what brought me to the West from England. I mean, I grew up in England and enjoyed the wildlife there, but we didn't have moose and bear and cougar and wolf, and that's really what drove me, I think, to make my way out here and study environmental philosophy. And yeah, when you run into a a bear or a moose. It's just, I mean, that thrill is really, it's something.
Christopher, do you see us running into idealism versus pragmatism? Kind of back to your comment there. Is that something we're dealing with or should be dealing with?
Well, I think...
is your book going to come across as idealism? I don't think so. I think you're talking pragmatism, but
I hope
how do you see that?
I hope it doesn't come across as idealistic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a positive book. This is a book designed to inject some optimism into our discussions about biodiversity. And the optimism is based on the fact that animals can come back. Yes, they're under a lot of pressure, but they can come back. But that optimism is tempered by what I hope is a pragmatism. They're not going to come back right away. Sometimes we might have to do things that we weren't anticipating doing. Sometimes it's going to take a while. But if we talk to enough people, if we do enough science, if we make the right moves, these animals can come back. And I think in almost every case, they provide a lot of benefit, a lot of excitement, economic opportunity, and so forth.
What's the reaction to your book been so far?
It's been positive, actually. Well, it doesn't surprise me. If you stand up in front of people and tell a positive story, they respond to it. Martin Luther King didn't say, "I have a nightmare." He said, "I have a dream." And here I'm trying to talk positively about wildlife, what they can be, what they can do, how we can live alongside them. I'm trying to excite people about that future. And people like that story. They respond to it very positively.
I think so. I hope so. We're having some pretty interesting stuff about removing dams now, don't we?
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
Yep.
Taking a dam out is a big deal. You have kind of an interesting example in your book.
Yeah, I went to the site of the Elwha dam removals on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. I'd heard about this for years, and it was a dream of mine to go there. What was special about the Elwha dams? There were two, the Elwha and the Glines Canyon Dam. What was special is that they were closing off habitat which was in Olympic National Park. And so as soon as you took those dams out, you opened up all this spawning habitat which was protected in a park. And the river comes out by the lower Elwha Clallam tribe reservation. So you've got a people at the mouth of the river whose culture is totally wedded to these tenacious salmon. So these dams came out about a decade ago, and boom, almost immediately, the fish started heading back up the river. And scientists are studying this, and over the next couple of decades, the situation is going to evolve and slowly improve, and you're going to get all 5 species of Pacific salmon. You're going to get 4 migratory trout species. You're going to get Pacific lamprey. Boy. You're going to get all these critters. And I got to add this: at the mouth of the Elwha, they've started to see very endangered killer whales patrolling back and forth because they're now finding salmon there. These big Chinook that they like to eat.
No kidding.
They're finding these salmon there. So it's an amazing story of wildlife recovery and also cultural recovery.
That's a great story. You know, one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is focused on invasive species. And I don't know how you look at that issue. Maybe the barred owl is almost in that category. But we got plants and animals and mussels and things like that. Have you thought much about that?
It's a very interesting and very philosophically difficult question, this, actually. You could imagine a world that was completely untouched and unmanipulated by humans, where all the species would be where they evolved, none of them would have moved, they'd just be living their own natural lives. But that's not the world we live in, right? Humans have influenced landscapes to a great extent, both physically and biologically. We've brought a lot of species with us, kind of riding our coattails, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally. And so there is this very complicated philosophical question here. Do these species need to go back to where they were brought from, or are there ways that we can recognize the benefits that they bring and accept that we now live in ecosystems that are influenced by us? And can we find ways to celebrate those ecosystems? And this is actually, you were asking about environmental philosophy. These sorts of questions are at the heart of environmental philosophy. They're really naughty questions.
Those are naughty questions. Do you have discussions about this with your students?
Oh yeah, this is bread and butter environmental philosophy stuff.
That would be so much fun.
Yeah, no, it is. It's really fun.
Yeah, and I bet the kids come up with clear thoughts about this, don't they?
Oh, I learn more from them than they learn from me. I'm pretty sure about that.
A lot of these kids are Montana, probably a lot of rural kids too.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So, Christopher, you ran into bison in England, huh? In your home country?
Yeah, extraordinary. So the bison that I cover mostly in the book are plains bison out here in the West. But back home, I grew up on the south coast of England, and my sister currently lives in Kent, outside Canterbury, and they have just reintroduced bison in a woodland outside of Canterbury. The first bison, to live in England for 30,000 years, to live wild in England. And there's 5 of them right now. And these bison are roaming on their own devices through this woodland. They're bringing the woodland back to health. So the motivation here, part of the motivation was it would be cool to have bison. But another part of the motivation is you had an overgrown woodland full of species which were non-native. And it was thought that these bison could bring the woodland back to health, and they're already starting to do that. They've only been there 6 months so far.
Oh my gosh.
But they're already making a difference. So it's a pretty exciting story. And for me, it's great because growing up in southern England, I'd see rabbits and foxes, maybe a badger, but I wouldn't see a 2,000-pound beast like a bison, and now I can. So it's a pretty exciting change.
But that's exciting over there.
Yeah.
Christopher, have you been on the National Bison Range?
Oh yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, it's a fascinating place. The first people to take steps to save and recover bison were the tribes. And so there was a couple of folks from the Flathead Reservation who went over to the Rocky Mountain front and brought about 6 bison back into the Flathead Valley and kept them there, knowing that out on the front, those bison were really in trouble. And the bison that they brought into the Flathead became the largest free-roaming herd of bison left. At one point, that herd helped restock the Yellowstone herd, if you can imagine that. The Yellowstone herd was so low that they needed bison, and they came from the Flathead there. And
so this goes back to the early 1900s?
So we're back, the bison first came over in the 1870s or 80s or so.
Oh, okay.
And that herd actually outgrew its space by about 1905. But those bison were then moved off to Canada, and they bided their time in Canada for about a century. And these very special bison, genetically pure, descendants of those last few that came over from the Rocky Mountain front, brought over by the tribe, those bison are now their herds are big enough and strong enough that they've become the source for a whole load of bison recovery.
What a great story that is.
In the States. And many of those bison are recovering on reservations now.
What are your plans in terms of getting this book out in front of people? I think we're glad you're going to do this tape with us. But
yeah, this has been a very interesting experience. I'm kind of a novice in the publishing world, right? And what you hope for these big successes where your book gets written up in the New York Times or something like that. And I've had a couple of successes, reviews in big magazines. But I actually think what you also have to do is you have to get in front of people. You have to tell stories. You have to meet people. You have to show them what you're writing about. You have to get them excited. And really reaching one person at a time. I have come to realize that that's as much part of selling a book as it is hitting the big time with some national review. So I'm trying to do both.
Trying to do both.
Yeah.
Christopher, thank you for being with us. And good luck on that book. I think it's great.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
I hope everybody reads it.
Me too. Yeah, thanks. So I want to end with one more little reading from the book here. And this reading is to illustrate the fact that recovering animals, obviously it's an opportunity for them. It's an opportunity for wildlife, but it's also an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for us to think differently, be different people, maybe be better people. And the section I want to read reflects something that happened to my wife and I. we wanted to see salmon near Missoula. And I had heard you could see salmon near Missoula. And I did a bit of detective work, which involved the Idaho Fish and Game people. And they said, I'll tell you where you can see salmon. So they sent us to a place where we saw some hatchery salmon. But I said, I want to see some wild salmon. And somebody at the hatchery said, I know a guy who knows where there's some wild salmon. I know a guy who knows a guy who knows. Anyway, I found this guy. And he told us where to go. And this is one of the tributaries above the Locksaw River in the Clearwater National Forest. And my wife and I saw some Chinook salmon there that were 600 miles from the ocean. They were 4,500 feet above sea level. They had gone through 4 Columbia River dams, 4 Snake River dams. They dodged predators, they dodged fishermen. And then they were depositing eggs in the same riffles in which they were born 6 or 7 years ago. If there was ever a tenacious beast, it's those salmon. So those salmon got me thinking. And I want to end just by reading a little paragraph here. There was one more thought I had as I left those salmon behind that evening. There will come a day when Earth's human population will peak. It may be shortly after the middle of this century, it may be later. Up to that moment, Earth's biodiversity is grinding its way up a hill like an ancient roller coaster, slowing so much it looks like it may never make it to the top. Each loud clack is a doubt about what will be left behind. But when it does reach the crest, the long struggle against gravity will finally flip to become an accelerating free fall. Millions of bodies will slither, fly, and hop their way back onto soils and waters released from service to human needs. Seeds will float in and take hold, rhizomes will reach outwards from their strongholds, and life-giving spores will alight on surfaces previously covered by crops and cement. There will be a joyous free-for-all as uncountable numbers of fins, hooves, paws, and carapaces rush onto newly liberated spaces. Recovering wildlife are the reservoirs that will fill out the green and blue spaces recoloring the map. The work we do now will be a bridge to a world we can only dream of. Trickles of possibility will become cascades of life as animals regain the room to flourish. Just as we did for thousands of years in the past, our species will start to remember an ancient wisdom born of entanglement with the lives of animals. We will find ourselves bending once again to the pull of biological forces that never fully went away.